Millerana. Schneider else.
The camera drifts through a winter morning in 1945 Germany. Snow falls in slow, uneven flakes, landing on burned rooftops and frozen corpses of tanks half buried in the fields. Somewhere beyond the haze, a woman hums brokenly, her voice trembling between grief and disbelief. The war is over, but her uniform still bears the black eagle of the Reich, its stitching frayed and dirty. Around her, a line of German women in tattered gray coats march through the frost toward a camp fenced with barbed wire and crowned with Allied flags. They are prisoners, secretaries, nurses, radio operators, clerks. Each carries the same question behind her hollow eyes. What will become of us? Inside the camp, an American officer waits by a wooden table stacked high with envelopes, hundreds of them. Letters from across a shattered Germany. He calls out names one after another. The women, uncertain, approach hesitantly. When the first envelope is handed over, the prisoner stares as if it were a bomb. She tears it open, and suddenly the world narrows to the page in her shaking hands. A familiar handwriting, a mother's blessing, a child's drawing. The letters from home have arrived, and in that instant, the women of a defeated nation begin to remember what humanity feels like. When the Reich collapsed, it did not fall with the roar of guns, but with the sound of paper, surrender orders, ration slips, identity cards fluttering through the ruins of Europe. In May 1945, the Allied armies overran Germany from every direction. Between the Red Army advancing from the east and the Anglo-American divisions pressing from the west, entire towns dissolved overnight. Civilians poured into the roads like refugees of the apocalypse, and among them, for the first time in any modern war, marched an army of women. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. Most had worn the gray uniform of the Nachrichtenhelferin, female communications auxiliaries of the Wehrmacht. Some had worked in hospitals, decoding offices, supply depots. Others had served the SS as typists or radio operators, never firing a weapon yet complicit in the machinery of war. When capture came, they were treated neither as civilians nor as combatants, but as something in between, dangerous enough to guard, too fragile to shoot. At a former Luftwaffe airfield near Kassel, the U.S. Army built one of the largest temporary holding camps for female POWs in occupied Germany. They called it simply Compound C. Rows of barracks stretched across the muddy field, each surrounded by wire and watchtowers. There were no beds, just straw, thin blankets, and the dull ache of humiliation. The women slept shoulder to shoulder, whispering names of cities that no longer existed. Hunger became their language. Silence, their shelter. Among them was 24-year-old Lieselotte Keller, once a radio operator in the Luftwaffe's 2nd Signal Regiment. She had spent the last months of the war relaying hopeless orders between collapsing divisions. Her fiancé, a pilot, had disappeared over the Rhine. When American troops entered her station, she didn't resist. She simply removed her headset and waited for the end. Now she sat on the cold ground of Compound C, clutching a tin mug, staring at the horizon that offered no escape. The guards treated them with wary professionalism. No cruelty, no comfort. Each morning the loudspeaker blared instructions in broken German: roll call, work detail, mealtime. The food, watery soup and bread, tasted of defeat. For months, letters had been forbidden. The Allies feared coded messages, revenge networks, hidden loyalties. But by autumn 1945, with Europe stabilizing, the Red Cross began delivering mail. It arrived in burlap sacks smelling of dust and ink, each envelope bearing the seal of a resurrected German postal service. When the first delivery came, the camp changed overnight. Rumors spread like wildfire, letters from home. Briefe von zu Hause. Some refused to believe it. Others prayed aloud. That evening, Captain Robert Haynes, the officer in charge of civilian POW welfare, stood at the long wooden table in the center of the yard, calling names from a manifest. Keller Lieselotte, he said, mispronouncing it Kaler. For a moment, no one moved. Then Lieselotte stepped forward, trembling. He handed her the envelope. She stared at it as if afraid to touch it. The handwriting, her mother's, the paper thin and yellowed. Inside, 3 pages written in pencil. The first words made her knees buckle. My dearest Lotte, we are alive. The house is gone, but we have potatoes in the garden. Your brother returned from the east, a skeleton but breathing. We heard you were captured by the Americans. Thank God. They are kinder than the Russians. Tears blurred the words. Around her others were weeping, laughing, collapsing. The sound was like rain after drought. Disbelieving, cleansing, unstoppable. That night the camp buzzed with life for the first time. Women gathered around lanterns, reading letters aloud. Some contained joy, a wedding, a birth, a miracle of survival. Others delivered death in careful phrases. But even grief was a kind of warmth. The world had spoken back to them. Captain Haynes watched from his quarters, unsure whether he had done something merciful or cruel. He had fought through France, seen the ruins of Buchenwald, buried friends in Normandy. To him, these women were ghosts of the enemy. Yet as he listened to their laughter mingling with sobs, he realized how young they were. War had devoured them and spat them out, and now they clung to the only thread left: words from home. The next morning, work details resumed, but everything felt different. The women moved with purpose, as if the letters had restored muscle to their bones. Liselotte folded hers carefully and kept it inside her blouse. When the guard shouted, she smiled faintly. Hope, fragile as the paper itself, had survived captivity. In the following weeks, more letters arrived. Some bore stamps from ruins, Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin. Others came from foreign camps where families were displaced. One woman received a parcel containing a child's drawing of a cat. She pinned it to the barrack wall, and soon the room was filled with paper cats, suns, flowers, defiant color sketched on gray walls. Yet not all letters brought comfort. Fräulein Erika Müller, once a clerk at the Reich Ministry of Supply, opened hers to find condemnation. You brought shame on our name, her father had written. Your work helped starve our people. Do not return. She folded the paper neatly and placed it into the stove. The ashes floated upward like dark snow. That evening, Liselotte found her staring at the flames. He will forgive you, she whispered. Erika shook her head. He shouldn't. Outside, wind rattled the barbed wire, sounding like distant typewriters, the ghosts of their past lives still tapping out orders that no one obeyed. Winter tightened its grip. Food grew scarcer. Disease crept through the barracks. But the letters kept coming, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes in bundles, a lifeline delivered by Allied trucks. The Red Cross organized reading sessions for those who could not read. Older women listened as younger ones read aloud, voices trembling with emotion. The Americans began to see something miraculous. Morale improving not through discipline but through empathy. Haynes wrote in his report, "It is remarkable how correspondence restores humanity to these prisoners. The enemy ceases to be an abstraction when she speaks of her mother's garden." In February 1946, the camp received a visit from a war correspondent, Martha Gellhorn, covering the reconstruction of Europe. She interviewed several of the women, including Liselotte. "What do you miss most?" Gellhorn asked. "My radio," Liselotte said with a shy smile. "Not to send orders, just to hear music again." Gellhorn nodded and later described her in an article. Among the defeated, there is a quiet courage in the women who choose to feel again. The following month, the Americans decided to allow limited broadcasts in the camp, short sessions where the women could listen to Allied news and classical music. When Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony played through the crackling speakers, many wept openly. For a few minutes, the barbed wire disappeared. Haynes watched from the guard tower, thinking of his own wife in Kansas who wrote to him every week, her letters creased and perfumed. He realized that these women were no different, caught in the same web of longing that bound soldiers and civilians alike. The act of reading, of remembering, was the bridge between enemy and human. One evening, Liselotte approached him near the fence. She held up her letter. "Thank you," she said in halting English. "For this," he nodded, unsure how to respond. "Your mother sounds strong," he said. "She was," Liselotte replied softly. "I hope she still is." The next day, he arranged for her to join the camp's translation detail, a small team of prisoners helping to catalog captured documents. It gave her purpose and dignity. She worked tirelessly, her mind sharp despite the hunger, and when new mail arrived, she distributed it herself, calling out names with the same authority Haynes once had. Each envelope passed from her hands felt like a spark passed through darkness. By the summer of 1946, Compound C began releasing prisoners for repatriation. One by one, the women left, some returning to ruins, others to nothing at all. On the day of her release, Liselotte packed her few belongings: A threadbare coat, a tin cup, and her mother's letters. Haynes met her at the gate. "Where will you go?" he asked. "Home," she said simply. "If it still exists." He offered his hand. She shook it firmly. "Good luck, Miss Keller." As she walked down the muddy road toward the horizon, snow melting into the ruts behind her, she felt the weight of the letters against her chest, proof that somewhere, beyond the fences and the guilt, life waited. She did not look back. The spring thaw of 1946 turned the camps of occupied Germany into oceans of mud. The snow that had hidden the wreckage melted away, revealing the bones of a continent trying to remember how to breathe. In Kassel, where Compound C stood like a gray island between the ruins, the earth gave off the smell of rust and wet straw. The prisoners swept their barracks, rebuilt makeshift gardens, and learned to live inside the rhythm of waiting. For letters, for release, for forgiveness that might never come. Lieselotte Keller woke before dawn every day. She had been assigned to the camp's administrative hut, assisting the Americans in cataloging mail, translating lists, and keeping order. To the other prisoners she was both hope and envy, the woman who handled the letters. Every sack of mail that arrived from the Red Cross was greeted like a miracle, and her hands were the first to touch it. She knew every face, every trembling voice calling out for news. Sometimes she delayed her own letters, reading others first, not out of duty but out of fear. Hope could be a cruel thing when it ran out. The Americans, for their part, began to relax their guard. The war was drifting into memory. The guards laughed more, spoke to the women without suspicion, even shared cigarettes. One of them, Sergeant Charlie Donovan, a mechanic from Boston, had a crooked grin and the kind of easy kindness that made people forget the past for a moment. He noticed Lieselotte one morning as she stood near the fence, staring at the rising sun through the mist. "Looks like home, doesn't it?" he said, stepping closer. She blinked, startled. "I don't know your home," he smiled. "Yeah, maybe that's the point." Over the following weeks, he would linger near the office, pretending to repair the truck engines while sneaking glances through the window. She pretended not to notice. Their conversations were cautious at first, exchanges of words, then smiles, then silence that felt almost tender. For the first time since the war began, she felt seen not as an enemy, but as a person. The camp's letters began to paint a new portrait of post-war Germany. Villages rebuilding, cities rationing coal, families reuniting through rubble. But the stories also carried guilt, of sons missing, of mothers who had denounced neighbors, of children raised under lies. The women of Compound C read these letters aloud at night, their candlelight flickering across faces lined with youth turned old too soon. One evening, as rain drummed on the roof, Lieselotte gathered with a small circle of women around the stove. Erica Miller sat beside her, her hands trembling as she unfolded a new letter. "It's from my brother," she whispered. "He found Father's grave near Magdeburg." They bowed their heads. No words were needed. Grief had its own grammar. After a long silence, another woman spoke. Anna Vogt, once a nurse at a field hospital in Warsaw. "I had no one left to write to," she said. "So I wrote to myself. The Americans mailed it back." The others laughed softly, the sound fragile but real. "What did it say?" Lieselotte asked. Anna smiled faintly. "It said, 'You're still alive. Remember that.'" By midsummer, the camp received a directive from Allied headquarters. All remaining German POWs, male and female, must be screened for potential war crimes before repatriation. The announcement dropped like a stone in water. Fear rippled through the barracks. Some women had worked in offices tied to the SS. Others had served in occupied territories where atrocities had been ordered. None knew what the interrogations would bring. The first group was called to the administrative hut one morning. American officers sat behind a table. Interpreters stood nearby. Each woman was questioned for hours, where she worked, what she knew, whom she obeyed. Most wept, some lied. A few stood proudly, insisting they had done their duty for the fatherland. But for many, shame had already dissolved ideology. They just wanted to go home. When Lieselotte's turn came, Captain Haynes himself conducted the questioning. He looked older now, wearier. The weight of the post-war years had settled into his shoulders. "You were a communications operator," he began. "Yes, sir. Did you ever relay messages ordering attacks on civilians?" "No, sir. Only military transmissions." "Were you aware of the concentration camps?" She hesitated. "Everyone heard rumors. We didn't believe them. We couldn't, he studied her. And now? She met his eyes. Now I do. He nodded slowly, writing something on his clipboard. You'll be cleared for release soon. Until then, keep helping with the mail. You're good at it. As she left the room, she felt both relief and guilt. So many others had not been cleared. Some had vanished into Soviet custody, never to return. She carried their names silently like stones in her pocket. Outside the wire, Germany's ruins were beginning to bloom again. Across the river, the Americans had built a new postal hub, and Lieselot was occasionally escorted there to help translate addresses. It was there she saw something that unsettled her. A convoy of trucks delivering mail not to German civilians, but to other German prisoners, those held in Allied labor camps, thousands still scattered across Europe. Their letters, too, were from home. She watched as British soldiers sorted the envelopes, their gloved hands moving mechanically. The sight made her chest tighten. They have letters, too, she murmured. Sergeant Donovan, who had accompanied her, shrugged. Everybody's got somebody waiting, I guess. She turned to him, eyes glistening. Even those who don't deserve it? He looked away. Especially them. That night she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking of the letters, millions of them, crossing borders, carrying forgiveness through the ruins. Ink and paper doing what guns could not. The thought both comforted and terrified her. Weeks passed. The fences around Compound C began to come down section by section. The women started to leave in groups, carrying their letters like passports. Each departure felt like a small funeral and a small resurrection. One morning, Erika Müller approached Lieselotte with a trembling smile. They're sending me home, she said. To Leipzig. My brother will meet me at the station. They embraced tightly. Write to me, Lieselotte said. Even if it takes years. I will, Erika promised. Maybe one day we'll have tea instead of tears. When her turn came to leave, Lieselotte found herself reluctant. The camp, once a prison, had become a kind of fragile sanctuary, a place where remorse and hope coexisted. Beyond the wire lay the unknown. On her final evening, Donovan found her near the fence staring at the sunset. So, he said softly, you're really going? Yes. She looked at him. And you? They'll ship me home next month, Boston. My mother writes every week. Does she know you talk to prisoners? He grinned. She'd probably send you cookies. For a moment, silence stretched between them, filled with all the things that could never be said. Then she reached through the wire and touched his hand. When you go home, she whispered, tell them. Thank you. For the letters, he nodded. You'll write? She smiled faintly. If they let me. The next morning, she was gone. Her barrack was empty except for a single folded piece of paper on the bunk, her last translation list, and beneath it one of her mother's letters, left behind. Donovan found it while making his rounds. He read the first line, My dearest Lotta, I dream you are warm, and quietly placed it in his pocket. The camp closed by autumn. The Americans dismantled the watchtowers, loaded the last supply trucks, and handed the grounds over to the new German authorities. Within a year, wild grass covered the barrack foundations, but in the archives of the U.S. Army, hundreds of letters remained. Unopened duplicates, censored copies, evidence of the strange mercy that had blossomed after defeat. Historians would later call them the letters that rebuilt Germany. As for Lieselotte, she arrived in Kassel to find her home a shell of stone and silence. Her mother had died of illness that spring. Her brother had emigrated to France. She was alone. For months she wandered between refugee centers, working as a translator for the Allied Control Commission. She never spoke of the camp, but she carried the memory of the letters wherever she went. Each time she saw an envelope, she felt her heart twist, not in grief, but in recognition of something sacred, the power of words to survive even when nations did not. In 1948, she began working for the Deutsche Post, the new federal postal service rising from the ashes. Her job was to sort mail for displaced persons, the endless search for people who had vanished in the war's wake. Every day she held in her hands fragments of other lives, a son's plea, a mother's confession, a lover's apology. Sometimes, when she found an undeliverable letter, she copied its contents into a notebook before sending it to the Lost Mail Archive. It was her way of keeping their voices alive. One entry read, My darling, the garden is blooming again. If you ever come home, you will find it waiting. Another, We are forgiven only when we forgive ourselves. She never signed her name, but she read them every night as if each one were a heartbeat she could still hear through the ruins. By 1950, Germany had changed beyond recognition. Cities rebuilt. Children born after the war filled classrooms. The Allied occupation softened into alliance. The letters kept coming, millions of them each week, carrying gossip, love, and the quiet insistence that life went on. One day, while sorting mail in the Frankfurt depot, Lieselot came across an envelope addressed to Charles Donovan, Boston, USA. Her breath caught. The return address was smudged, but the handwriting was unmistakable, her own. She didn't remember writing it. Hands trembling, she slid it open. Inside was a single sheet. I am free now. The fences are gone. I do not know if you will remember me, but I remember the kindness in your eyes when you gave me a letter that was not yours. If this ever reaches you, know that you helped me believe again. She must have written it that last night in the camp, too afraid to send it. Somehow it had traveled through the labyrinth of bureaucracy and found its way back to her. A letter from the past, addressed to the man who had once bridged the wire. She pressed it to her heart and smiled. The war was truly over. The first sound that reached her every morning was the clatter of mailbags, the heartbeat of a nation learning to write again. By 1950, Lieselot Keller's life revolved entirely around envelopes. She handled them by the hundreds each day in the Frankfurt depot, moving her hands with a rhythm that felt sacred. Every name, every stamp, every faint trace of perfume told her that Germany had not died. The country was rebuilding itself not with bricks and steel, but with words. Outside the windows of the sorting hall, the city hummed with rebirth. Cranes dotted the skyline, lifting beams over ruins still pockmarked by shellfire. Trains rolled through the new station bearing coal, food, and letters, always letters. And through this new artery of communication, the pulse of humanity returned to Europe. Children who had been born in exile were writing to grandparents they had never met. Lovers separated by prison fences were finding each other again. The post was the bridge between ghosts and the living. Lieselot worked in silence, her hair tied neatly, her uniform pressed. To her co-workers, she was efficient, polite, a little distant. Few knew she had once been a prisoner herself. She never mentioned Compound C or the Americans who had taught her mercy. Her letters from that time, the ones she hadn't burned, were locked away in a small wooden box beneath her bed. At night, she sometimes opened it, tracing the faded handwriting of her mother's last words, whispering them into the dark. The house is gone, but we have potatoes in the garden. She no longer had the garden, but she had the words. And that was enough. That spring, a new assignment arrived from the central office. The Postal Service was organizing an unprecedented operation, the Cross-Border Reconnection Program, a joint effort with the Allied High Commission to reunite families divided by occupation zones. The Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, slicing Germany into east and west. Letters crossing from one side to the other were censored, delayed, sometimes lost forever. The new initiative sought to change that. A small team of trusted translators and clerks would handle sensitive correspondence between relatives separated by the Soviet zone. Lieselot was chosen for her precision and her fluency in both English and Russian. The work began in a dimly lit office near the River Main. Each morning, bags of intercepted letters arrived from the eastern border, some opened by Soviet censors, others sealed but bearing strange stains as if handled roughly. Her task was to verify addresses, check for contraband language, and forward approved letters to their intended destinations. Every envelope was a life story compressed into paper. One evening, as she was working through a stack marked Berlin Sector Exchange, she found a name that froze her breath. Erika Müller. The handwriting was unmistakable. The return address, Leipzig, Soviet zone. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the sheet. The ink had bled from dampness, but the words were still legible. My dearest Lotta, I have tried for years to find you. I am alive. Our home is gone, but I teach in a small school now. The children know nothing of war. Sometimes that feels like mercy. Sometimes it feels like forgetting.
If this letter reaches you, please write back.
Tell me you still believe in kindness. Lieselot pressed her palm to her mouth, tears spilling before she could stop them. In her mind, she saw Erika's face by the stove in Compound C, the glow of the coals reflecting off her eyes. "He will forgive you," she had said. And now, years later, forgiveness had crossed the border like a ghost slipping through barbed wire. She wrote back that night, her handwriting steady despite the emotion shaking her body. "Erica, I am here. I sort the letters now, all of them. I live among words, though none mean more than yours. I remember the camp, the snow, the laughter when the first mail came. I remember you reading your brother's letter aloud. I am still that person, but lighter now. I believe in kindness because we had nothing else. If this reaches you, write again." She sealed the envelope and stamped it with the blue eagle of the West German Post. For the first time since her release, she wrote her own return address without hesitation. It felt like reclaiming her name. The weeks that followed were filled with a quiet anticipation. Every time a courier from the Eastern Zone arrived, her heart raced. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. Then one rainy afternoon in October, a clerk handed her a small bundle marked "Incoming Mail Restricted." She recognized the handwriting instantly. Erica's reply. The letter was brief, written in the clipped tone of someone conscious of watching eyes. "Lotta, I received your words. I am well. There are things I cannot say. We live under new rules now. But when I teach the children to write, I tell them letters are stronger than borders. That is my quiet rebellion. Thank you for reminding me I am not alone." Lieselot folded it carefully and slipped it into her box. That night she walked along the riverbank, the city lights glimmering like constellations on the water. The air smelled of coal and rain. For the first time in years she whispered a prayer, not to God but to history itself. Let the words keep crossing. By the winter of 1951, the Cold War had hardened. Communication between East and West grew dangerous. Letters were confiscated, censored, sometimes rewritten entirely by unseen hands. Still, people wrote. It was their last act of defiance, and in the Frankfurt office, Lieselotta's team continued their work, quietly passing messages through the labyrinth of bureaucracy. One morning, she received a visit from a British officer attached to the Allied Postal Authority, Major Thomas Albright, tall, polished, with a wariness that never left his eyes. He had fought at Arnhem and carried himself like a man who had seen too much. "Miss Keller," he said, "we've been reviewing your record. You've handled more cross-border correspondence than anyone in your division. There's an assignment we'd like you to take on." He laid a folder on the desk. Inside were letters confiscated from a Soviet courier. They were written by German families in the East to relatives in the West but had never been delivered. "We want them translated and logged," Albright said. "But some may contain sensitive material. We'll need discretion." She nodded. "You have it." For days she read through those intercepted voices, the confessions, the hidden grief. One letter from a father in Dresden read, "We are told not to speak of the past, but every night I whisper your name. Forgive me for surviving where you could not." Another from a mother in Magdeburg. "The ration is one loaf a week, but we share it. Bread tastes better when shared. Perhaps that is freedom." By the time she finished, she realized she had been crying without noticing. The ink on the last page blurred beneath her tears. Major Albright, watching from the doorway, said quietly, "You care too much, Miss Keller." She looked up, eyes burning. "Someone should." He smiled faintly. "That's why we chose you." Weeks passed and their work grew heavier. Yet amidst the endless tide of mail, small miracles occurred. A child's drawing tucked into a letter reached a mother who thought him dead. A husband, presumed lost in a Soviet mine, replied after 5 years with a single line, "I still dream of the smell of our kitchen." Each of these recoveries spread through the office like sparks, lighting even the bleakest days. Sometimes late at night, Lieselot and Major Albright shared coffee in the dim light of the sorting room. He told her about his sister who had died during the Blitz. "Every time I see a letter," he said, "I think of the one I never sent her, telling her I was proud." "And you?" he asked gently. "Who would you write to if you could?" She hesitated. "To the man who gave me my first letter after the war. An American sergeant. He handed it to me like it was salvation. I never thanked him properly." Albright nodded. "Maybe you just did." They fell silent, listening to the rain tapping against the roof, a rhythm that felt like Morse code from another life. By 1952, the cross-border program had grown into an international network. The Red Cross, the Vatican, and even neutral Sweden participated. Millions of letters crossed borders each month. But for every message that found its way home, 100 vanished into the bureaucracy of fear. In East Germany, propaganda posters warned citizens against Western sentimentality. Yet secretly, in attics and basements, families hid their letters, wrapped in cloth like sacred relics. One afternoon, a courier delivered a small parcel from the Eastern Zone addressed to the German Postal Office, Frankfurt, to be forwarded. Inside was a bundle of letters tied with blue string and a note in careful handwriting. To whoever handles these, please keep them safe. They belong to those who still hope. Lieselot lifted the letters and inhaled their scent. Damp paper, ink, a trace of lavender. She spent hours cataloging them, refusing to send them to the incinerator. Instead, she placed them in a separate box marked Unsent Hope. Every Friday, she would open it, reading one letter aloud to her team. It became a ritual, the resurrection of the voiceless. One letter read, "My darling, I can't cross the border, but my words can. Follow them." Another, "If they ever read this, they will know that we were not silent." Even Albright, ever composed, began to participate. "You know," he said one night after she finished reading, "history won't remember this part. The letters, the women who handled them. But maybe that's all right. Maybe peace isn't meant to be remembered, just lived." In December 1952, just before Christmas, a package arrived addressed to L. Keller. It bore a U.S. stamp. Her heart leapt. America. Handshaking, she tore it open. Inside was a letter and a photograph. The letter began, "Frankfurt, I hope this reaches you. My name is Charles Donovan. You won't remember me, but I was stationed near Kassel in '46. I found a letter once, your mother's, I think, and kept it all these years. I always meant to send it back. I'm doing that now." The photograph showed an older man in a small diner, an American flag behind him, a sign above the counter reading Home Letters Cafe. On the back he had written, "For every letter that reached its home, a war ended." She sat motionless for a long time, staring at the image through tears. The loop was complete. The letter had gone full circle, from her mother to her, from her to him, and now back again. Across oceans and years, their shared humanity had survived. That night, she placed the photograph beside her bed, next to the wooden box of saved letters. The wind outside carried the scent of snow, and somewhere in the city a church bell rang. She whispered into the silence, "Thank you, Charles. We're all home now." The year was 1953, and Germany was learning to speak again. In the ruins of words left unsent, a new kind of courage was forming. Not in the speeches of politicians or the rhetoric of generals, but in the quiet scratch of pens against paper. Letters had become the country's lifeline, its collective conscience stitched together with ink. And in Frankfurt, amid the endless hum of mail conveyors and sorting machines, Lieselot Keller was still at her post, still listening to the whispers of the world as they passed through her hands. She had grown older, not in years but in weight. The post-war bloom that had once lifted the city was beginning to fade beneath the gray shadow of the Cold War. Every border crossing was now guarded not by soldiers, but by suspicion. Words were no longer entirely free. Every envelope carried its own form of danger. And yet they kept coming. The postal depot had changed. Machines now clicked and whirred where human hands once sorted. The work was faster but colder. Still, Lieselotte insisted on reading the handwriting whenever she could, deciphering the curls and loops that no machine could understand. She had learned to read pain through pen pressure, hope through spacing, fear through pauses. That February she was assigned to a new division, recovered mail, zone transfers. It handled the letters found in destroyed post offices, train wrecks, or abandoned mailbags from the chaos of the war's final days, correspondence that had vanished into history. The Allies called them orphans of the post. Decades later, people would call them miracles. Each envelope carried a timestamp frozen in 1944 or 1945, the ink still dark, the names often faded. Some were addressed to soldiers who had never returned, others to homes that no longer existed. Her job was to trace the names, find descendants, and deliver what time had stolen. It was the closest thing Germany had to resurrection. On her first day in the new office, she opened a sealed pouch labeled Recovered Mail, Wittenberg Train Depot, April 1945. Inside were 27 letters, all brittle with age. One addressed in elegant handwriting caught her eye. Frau Anneliese Reinhardt, Bremen. The return name made her heart skip. Corporal Emil Reinhardt, 6th Infantry Eastern Front. She held it to her nose. The faint scent of tobacco lingered, impossible yet undeniable. Slowly, she unfolded the paper. My dearest Anna, if this reaches you, the world will have changed again. The snow never stops here. We are told to hold the line, but the line feels like a grave. I dream of your bread, the one with poppy seeds. I dream of peace, though I cannot say it aloud. If I fall, know that my last thought was of home. There was no date beyond February, no year. But she knew, 1945, the final, hopeless months on the Eastern Front. She tracked the addressee through municipal records. Anneliese Reinhardt had died in 1946, starvation and fever. No children, no surviving relatives. For a long moment, Lieselot simply stared at the paper, her hand trembling. The letter had survived 70 miles of war, 8 years of silence, and yet had no one left to receive it. That night, she took it home and placed it on her windowsill. You made it, she whispered. That's enough. Days turned into weeks, and she found herself living among the dead voices of the past. Each recovered letter was a story half told, an emotion suspended midair. She read them all, cataloging, cross-referencing, hoping for small victories, and occasionally, miracles happened. One letter, dated April 20th, 1945, was addressed to Miss Ruth Albrecht, Stuttgart. It was written by an American prisoner of war held in Germany, Private David Wilson, U.S. Army Air Corps. The censor's stamp was still visible. In shaky handwriting he had written, They treat us better than I expected. One woman brings us soup every week. Her name is Ruth. If you ever find her, tell her she reminded me of home. Lieselotte traced the name and found Ruth Albrecht still alive, now an old woman living in Stuttgart's southern district. She wrote to her immediately, enclosing the letter. 2 weeks later, a reply arrived written in careful, trembling script. Dear Miss Keller, I am that Ruth. I remember the Americans. I never knew any of them survived. I am grateful that he remembered. I wish I could tell him that I still cook the same soup. For days afterward, Lieselot carried that reply in her pocket, rereading it like scripture. Proof that kindness, even in the smallest acts, echoed beyond its moment. The next case struck closer to her own heart. Among a batch of recovered mail from a collapsed military post near Kassel, she found a letter addressed to Radio Operator L. Keller, Luftwaffe, 2nd Signal Regiment. Her breath caught. Her own name. She opened it slowly, terrified and trembling. Inside was a single sheet of thin blue paper. The handwriting was unmistakable, her fiancé's, the one lost over the Rhine. My beloved Lotte, the engines are frozen, the sky full of smoke. I do not know if I will return. But if I don't, promise me you will not live in bitterness. Promise me you will remember the sound of laughter. You once told me letters are just voices written down. Then listen to mine forever. She could no longer breathe. For a long while she simply sat, letting the tears fall silently onto the page. The ink blurred where her fingers touched it, merging past and present. She folded it carefully and pressed it to her heart. Her voice came out as a whisper. I kept your promise. That night she didn't sleep. She sat at her table, pen in hand, and wrote a reply she knew would never be sent. My dearest Emil, I received your letter today. 8 years too late and yet just in time. I did not live in bitterness. I lived in letters. I have seen the faces of those we once called enemies, and they are the same as ours. You would have liked them. I think you would have understood. She folded the reply and placed it inside the same envelope, sealing their words together forever. Her work in the recovered mail office began to draw attention. Newspapers occasionally published human interest stories about the woman who delivered the dead. She refused interviews, but she kept every clipping. It wasn't vanity, it was reverence. Every name printed meant another voice remembered. Major Albright visited often. He had been reassigned to the British Embassy, but made excuses to stop by. You've turned the mailroom into a chapel, he told her once, half in admiration, half in awe. It's not faith, she replied. It's repair. Of what? He asked. She looked up from her desk, eyes soft but tired. Of silence. They spoke often after that, about the strange weight of post-war peace, the way people pretended it was whole when in truth it was stitched from fragments. Sometimes he stayed until late evening, helping her organize the recovered envelopes. They never spoke of affection, but it lingered in the quiet between their words, unspoken yet deeply understood. By the summer of 1954, Lieselotte's work expanded beyond Germany. Letters from Poland, France, and even the Soviet Union began arriving. Documents rediscovered in depots and archives, now being returned to families decades later. She became the unofficial coordinator of what journalists would call the Europe Letters Project. One afternoon, she received a telegram from the Red Cross office in Geneva. Request you to handle special delivery case. Recovered letter addressed to POW Camp C, Castle. 1945, origin unknown. Her breath caught. Compound C, the place where it all began. The letter arrived in a sealed pouch a week later. The envelope was fragile, its ink faded but still legible. To the American officer who read our names, Compound C. No return address. No signature. Inside, written in careful feminine handwriting. We do not know your name, but we remember your voice. You called us not as enemies, but as people. You gave us letters when we thought the world had forgotten us. If this finds you, know that we have lived. Some became teachers, some nurses, some mothers again. Because of you, we wrote. Because of you, we forgave. Lieselotte sat frozen. She could see it clearly. The snow, the yard, the table stacked with envelopes. Captain Haynes standing in the cold, calling their names. She felt his voice echo through the years. He was gone now. She had learned he'd died in 1951, but his kindness had rippled outward through every word ever written. Since that day, she placed the letter in the recovered mail archive with a note in the margin. Delivered. To history. That autumn, a delegation of postal workers from across Europe gathered in Frankfurt for a ceremony commemorating 10 years of post-war reconstruction. Lieselotte was invited to speak, though she hesitated at first. She had never addressed a crowd. But Albright urged her. You've spent 10 years giving others their voices. Now use yours. She stepped onto the stage, the hall filled with clerks, soldiers, journalists. The hum of conversation quieted. Her voice, when it came, was soft but steady. Letters, she began, are the only things that survived our war without hatred. Bombs destroyed our cities, politics divided our families, but the words we wrote, they endured. They waited for us to become human again. She paused, eyes glistening in the lights. I once received a letter from a man who never came home. It arrived 8 years late. He asked me to remember laughter. I think that's what all letters ask of us, to remember who we are when the noise stops. The audience was silent. And then slowly, applause rose, hesitant at first, then thunderous, echoing through the hall like a promise kept. That winter, the postal office established a permanent archive for war correspondence, the Keller collection of human letters. Thousands of envelopes were preserved under glass, their ink fading but immortal. Visitors came from around the world to read them. Schoolchildren stared wide-eyed at the yellowed pages, realizing that history was not written by generals, but by ordinary people who dared to speak across silence. Lieselotte continued her work quietly until her retirement in 1956. On her last day, she stayed late, walking through the rows of shelves one final time. The smell of paper, dust, and ink filled the air, the scent of everything she had lived for. She stopped at one particular display, Compound C, 1945. Inside, the first Red Cross delivery sat preserved, the same sacks of letters that had changed her life. She placed her hand on the glass and whispered, "We made it." Then she turned out the light. By 1960, the war was no longer spoken of as the war. It had become back then a ghost phrase that hung in conversation like a shadow no one wanted to name. But in the heart of Frankfurt, inside the climate-controlled silence of the Keller archive, the ghosts still spoke. They lived in envelopes stacked in glass cabinets, in the looping handwriting of vanished hands. They breathed through ink and paper, whispering through the decades to anyone willing to listen. Lieselotte Keller, now 50, still came to the archive 3 times a week, though she had officially retired 4 years earlier. Her hair had gone silver, her back slightly stooped, but her eyes remained alert, the same gray-green that had once scanned through piles of wartime mail by lantern light. The younger clerks called her Frau Briefe, the woman of letters. She laughed at the nickname but secretly cherished it. There were worse legacies. Outside, West Germany pulsed with optimism. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, had turned rubble into skylines. Neon lights glowed over cafes filled with jazz and conversation. Children raced through streets rebuilt from ashes. The people of her country had learned to look forward. But Lieselot's work was about looking back, not in sorrow but in gratitude, as if each recovered letter were a heartbeat found beneath the ruins. That spring, she was asked by the Ministry of Culture to assist in curating a traveling exhibition. Voices After Silence, Letters from War. It would tour Bonn, Munich, and Berlin before being shown in London and Paris. The goal was reconciliation, to show Europe not through the eyes of generals, but through the words of those who had suffered. They wanted her to select 20 letters from the archive that best told the story. She spent weeks combing through the files, reading thousands of pages she already knew by heart. Some were too painful, others too private. Eventually, she chose a collection that formed a kind of invisible dialogue. Soldiers and mothers, enemies and friends, victims and survivors, each answering one another across time. But one letter stopped her cold. It was dated April 12, 1945. Marked Forwarded POW Camp C, Kassel. The envelope was yellowed and fragile. The handwriting unmistakably feminine. The name on the front read, "To Captain Robert Haynes, U.S. Army." Her throat tightened. She remembered him, the calm voice calling names from the table in the snow, the man who handed her the letter that had saved her sanity. She unfolded the paper carefully. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. "Captain Haynes, you do not know me. I was one of the women you called that day. Keller, Lieselot. I want you to know that your kindness was not forgotten. When you gave us those letters, you gave us back the sound of our own names. You treated us as people when the world called us monsters. If you never read this, still I had to write it. Because sometimes saying thank you is the only way to live again." The signature was her own. She had no memory of writing it. Her hand shook as she turned the page over. On the back, faint pencil marks under another handwriting, hurried masculine, returned, "Addressee deceased, March 1946. The paper fluttered from her fingers. For several minutes she sat motionless, the room spinning softly around her. He had never read it. The man who'd called her name that day, who'd handed her her mother's letter like salvation, had died before hearing her gratitude. A silence deeper than grief filled her chest, not loss, but the weight of an unanswered kindness. She placed the letter back in its sleeve and whispered, "You were never forgotten, Captain." Her voice trembled, but the words steadied her. Gratitude, even unreceived, was still alive. The exhibition opened in Bonn that autumn. The hall was filled with glass cases and photographs, faces of soldiers, mothers, nurses, all caught in the frozen stillness of black and white. Visitors moved in silence between displays, reading fragments of the letters printed beneath. Some wept openly. Others stood motionless for minutes before moving on. The air smelled faintly of paper and polish, and something else. Reverence. Lieselot stood by one of the displays, a curator among ghosts. She had chosen a title for the exhibit's final section, "The Letters That Forgave the World." There, under soft light, lay her own letter to Captain Haynes, beside one of his typed reports. The placard beneath read simply, "Delivered, 1960, recipient, history." When she looked up, she noticed a man in his 30s standing near the display, studying it with an intensity that made her uneasy. He wore a U.S. Army lapel pin on his coat. After a long pause, he turned toward her. "You're Frau Keller?" he asked in English. "Yes," she said softly. "Do we know each other?" He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded photograph. It showed a young officer standing beside a jeep, smiling beneath a winter sun. "My father," the man said. "Robert Haynes," her breath caught. The resemblance was unmistakable, the same jawline, the same steady eyes. "I came because I heard your name," he continued. "When I saw the letter, I knew. My father spoke about you once in his diary, a German radio operator who said thank you with her eyes before walking away." Lieselot felt tears burn her throat. "He saved us," she whispered. "He saved me." The man nodded, eyes bright. "He never knew you wrote this letter. He died before it reached him. But if it's all right, I'd like to take a copy home to his wife. My mother still keeps his uniform folded on the chair by her bed. She nodded, unable to speak. He pressed her hand gently. He would have wanted to know you were alive. After he left, she sat in the empty hall long after closing, the echo of footsteps fading into the marble. For the first time, the circle had closed. Her words had found their way home, even if by a different path. The exhibition toured Europe and America, drawing thousands. In London, the Times called it a testament to letters as the architecture of peace. In Paris, schoolchildren wrote essays titled A Letter I Would Have Sent. And in New York, at the Museum of Modern History, Lieselot was invited to speak. She had not flown before. The flight over the Atlantic terrified her at first, the hum of the engines, the vast dark water below. But somewhere over Greenland, she pressed her forehead against the window and whispered, "Emile, I made it across." The thought made her smile. At the New York opening, she stood before a crowd of veterans, scholars, and journalists. Behind her, projected on a massive screen, was a photograph of a German woman reading a letter in the snow, one of the original images from Compound C, 1945. Her voice echoed softly through the hall. When we wrote to each other across barbed wire, we were not trading information. We were remembering how to be human. Each letter was an act of rebellion, against hatred, against silence, against forgetting. A hush fell over the audience. "I stand here," she continued, "as someone who once received mercy in an envelope. I believe the world survives only because someone, somewhere, decides to write instead of hate." The applause that followed was long and gentle, the kind that feels less like celebration and more like prayer. She returned to Germany a month later, exhausted but peaceful. The exhibition continued without her, touring schools and libraries. She resumed her quiet routine. Morning tea, walks by the river, afternoons in the archive cataloging new donations. She was content to fade into the background, letting the letters speak for themselves. But history, it seemed, was not finished with her. In 1962, an envelope arrived at the archive addressed to the curator of the Keller collection. The stamp bore a British postmark. Inside was a single page written in neat cursive. "Frau Keller, I attended your exhibition in London last year. My name is Margaret Haynes, widow of Captain Robert Haynes. Our son showed me your letter. I read it aloud to my husband's photograph, and for the first time since 1946, I felt at peace. He would have been proud of you, proud of what you did with the life he helped save. Thank you for finding him again, even after death." At the bottom was a small postscript. "I enclose something that belongs with you." Folded inside was a faded photograph. The camp yard at Kassel. Women standing in the snow, Haynes in the foreground handing an envelope to a young prisoner. The young woman's face, half turned, was unmistakably hers. She stared at it for a long time, tracing the blurred outlines with her fingertips. The image was proof, not just of survival, but of connection, of two lives intersecting for an instant that changed everything. She framed it and hung it above her desk in the archive, where it remained for the rest of her life. The years passed quietly. The world shifted. New wars, new borders, new letters written by new hands. Yet within the Keller archive, time stood still. Visitors still came to read the words of strangers long dead. They still cried softly in the stillness, still left flowers by the display marked Compound C. By 1970, her hair was snow white. Her movements had slowed, but her memory remained sharp. One December afternoon, as snow fell outside, she sat alone at her desk, reading a letter from the new exhibit in preparation. Letters of Peace 25 years after. It was addressed to no one and everyone, written by an unknown German child in 1946. "Dear whoever reads this, I was born after the war. My mother says I must never hate. She says letters are safer than bombs. I do not know what war feels like, but I think it sounds like silence. Please, whoever you are, keep writing." She smiled, folded the page, and placed it in the exhibit binder. The snow outside the window blurred the world into white. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, the same note she had heard 25 years ago when she walked free from the camp. She took a blank sheet of paper and began to write one last letter. "To whoever finds this, I have spent my life delivering other people's words. Now these are mine. We cannot undo what we did, but we can choose what to remember. Remember the letters. Remember that mercy is a kind of handwriting. The more you practice it, the steadier it becomes. When you write to someone you do not know, you are already healing the world a little. With love, Liselotte Keller. She sealed it, labeled it to the future, and placed it in the archive's final drawer. That night, she went home, made herself tea, and sat by the window as the snow fell thicker. The city glowed faintly beneath the storm. She thought of Emile, of Erica, of Haynes, of all the letters she had held that had outlived their senders. Then she closed her eyes. She passed away quietly in her sleep, the faint scent of paper and ink still clinging to her hands. When the archivist found her letter the next morning, they placed it in a display case under a simple plaque. The last letter. Written December 14th, 1970. Opened 1985, it reads, "Mercy is a kind of handwriting." Visitors still pause there longest. Decades later, historians would credit the Keller archive with preserving over 200,000 personal letters from the war, each one a fragment of humanity recovered from fire. The exhibition became permanent, its final room titled "To the Future." There, under low light, a single glass case displays her last letter beside the photograph of Captain Haynes and the girl in the snow. People leave their own letters there now, to lost fathers, to forgotten mothers, to strangers who showed kindness when it mattered most. The archive staff collects them once a year and seals them in a box labeled "Unsent Hope," just as Liselotte once did. If you walk into that room today, you will see them. Thousands of envelopes glowing softly under the lights, their edges curling like wings. You will hear faintly the sound of paper rustling, as if history itself is breathing. And in that breath, you can almost hear her voice again, gentle and steady, whispering from somewhere beyond time. The war ends every time a letter is opened.